Hello lovely people, this is the 2019 exam 2 for general math, formerly known further math, network section. So looking at this one, we've got an activity network with 12 activities, A through L, times shown in weeks. The minimum time is 35 weeks. How many activities on the critical path? Not a bad idea to ever, as a general rule of thumb, just determine the critical path. So we know that A and B are both going to be critical activities because those are the only choices we have. F is critical for the same reason as is L. And then we've got these two little sections in the graph. So it's either going to be that CE is critical or D. CE takes 8 and D takes 9. That means that C and E both have floats of 1, so they're not critical, they have floats of 1. And then over here we've got GJ, which is 8, GIK, which is 13, and HK, which is 12. So the longest route through the graph is going to be this. We can actually determine the floats of these two, which is going to be useful in a second. So the float of this is 1 and 1, as we just found. The float of H, comparing the H to the GI, which is 6, means that the H has a float of 1. And comparing J to the IK means that J has a float of 5. So IK takes 9, J takes 4, so it has a float of 5. So the number of activities on the critical path is A, B, D, F, G, I, K, L, so that's 8. And the LST of activity E, so the EST of activity E would be 2 plus 4 plus 5 to get to this location. So the EST plus 1, because it's got a float of 1, is going to be the LST. So we know LST take away EST is float. In this case, we know the float is 1, so we can do EST plus 1 is LST. So 2 plus 4 plus 5 is 11, plus 1 is 12. Which activity has the longest float? We've already determined. Again, that was J with a float of 5. It's possible to reduce the completion times for C, D, G, H, and K by employing more workers. We can reduce each activity by a maximum of 2 weeks. What is the minimum time in weeks the project will take? And looking ahead, and you should do this in reading time, you should know what's coming. The next question is about optimization. So we're going to keep an eye out for how this might be optimized for the next part, but I can reduce C, D, G, H, and K each by 2. So we'll get rid of these. So I can reduce C, D, G, H, K each by 2. Reducing C and D by 2 would reduce the critical path by 2, because this route would then become 7 through the D or 6 through the C and the E. So that's going to reduce it by 2 total. Reducing G, H, and K all by 2. So if G would have become 2, H would have become 3, and K would have become 5, then I would have my old critical path being 2, 2, 5, which would be a total of 9. I would have the HK would be 3 and 5, which would be 8. I would have the GJ, which would be 2 and 4, which would be 6. So it looks like reducing G and K each by 2 would reduce the critical path, and H, I suppose, if we reduced them all, would reduce the critical path down to 2 plus 2 plus 5, which would be 9. And so originally this took 4 plus 2 plus 7, which was 13, so it's reduced it by 4. So that's been reduced by 4. The other section's been reduced by 2. So the minimum time it could take, since the original completion time was 35 weeks, the minimum time we could complete it now is going to be 29 weeks. Since we figured out we could reduce it by 6, so 2 in that first section and 4 in that last section. The reduction in completion time would incur an additional cost. So now we have different costs for each activity to reduce them. The completion time for each can be reduced by a maximum of 2. We want to require the overall completion time to be reduced by 4 weeks, so not 6, which I think we found we could do. We could do 6. We want to reduce it by 4 at a minimum cost. Okay, so we've got to figure out. So it's C, D, G, H, and K that we can reduce. So again, I'll leave those underlined. So to reduce the critical path by 1, my choices right now are to reduce D by 1, G by 1, or K by 1. And we're going to do this one at a time. So D or G or K by 1 will reduce the critical path by 1. So D or G or K, so it's going to be cheapest to reduce D by 1. So we'll start by reducing activity D by 1. So that's going to become an 8. What you'll notice now is that the CE route, which is 8, and the D route, which is also 8, are now both critical. So the next choice to reduce the critical path by 1 is to reduce both C and D by 1, and that will reduce this section by 1, or G by 1, or K by 1. So it's C and D by 1, G by 1, K by 1 as my three choices. C and D would cost 5,000, G would cost 2.5, K would cost 4,000, so I'll reduce G by 1. So far I've reduced the length by 2 weeks, I think it was weeks. So D and G both reduced by 1, so I'll note that, so that's going to be a 3 now. Again, what you'll notice is that the GI root, which takes 5, and the H root, which also takes 5, they're both critical. So, to reduce the overall completion time, I've got choices. It's either C and D by 1 to reduce this section, G and H by 1 to reduce this section, or K by 1. So it's C and D, G and H, or K. C and D is 5,000, G and H is 3,500, K is 4,000. So I'll reduce G and H each by 1 for 3,500. And again, that only reduces the critical path by 1 though, because I had to reduce both G and H so that both of those roots were decreased. So G is now 2, H is now 4, and I can't reduce the GH part anymore because G has been reduced by 2 and the max I'm allowed to reduce by is 2. So my choices now is to reduce C and D by 1. G and H are no longer viable, so reducing H wouldn't do anything because G would become critical, or GI would become critical, I would say, and H would just not be critical anymore. So it's either C and D or K. So C and D would be 5,000, K is 4,000, so I'll reduce K by 1, and I've reduced the total thing by 4 so far. So it'll be 0 for C, 1 for D, 2 for G, 1 for H, and 1 for K. And just as a tidbit, 3% of the state got that question correct, so certainly on the trickier side, but if you take it as a step-by-step for these kind of questions where they sort of meet and then meet and then meet and then meet again, so they've kind of, you can break it into sections, I think that's probably the easiest way to approach a question like this. Cool, so I hope that helps, and I'll see you in the next one.